Hello, and welcome back to the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Tita Koshi, and today we're going to be talking about Ladybug from Bullet Train, specifically his moral alignment. And beware as there are spoilers ahead. So, normally at the beginning of these videos, I advise going back to watch my introduction to the FTP video if any terms are confusing. The nature of good and evil is embedded in our value structure in the way that we talk about a lot of things. So it's not like you need to chaotic and lawful is a very like common thing to divide things in, and good and evil is um, so continuous it's endemic. Um, so chaotic versus lawful, that's a thing. We'll compare between those, but notice how there's no evil votes. Ladybug is pretty much a good character, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about neutral versus we'll talk about the whole thing. So in terms of lawful, chaotic, and in between, um, lawful and chaotic in alignment is basically just a cross check for conscientiousness in the Big Five. It's just are you structured in the way that you encounter the world, or are you more adaptable, reflexive, and you know chaotic? And Ladybug is clearly unstructured, in terms of conscientiousness. Not only that, not only is he more adaptable and less rigid in the way that he pursues actions, including moral ones, um, he chaos follows him. Chaos is an active thing with him because of his bad luck. And so, given that, I think he's pretty decisively, in my opinion, chaotic over neutral in terms of um, leanings. If I were to look at Ladybug at scale, I would call him chaotic in terms of alignment. Now, this is the thing that is a much bigger deal and a much bigger thing to talk about. So, morality is complicated. So to reach back a little bit to Alex O'Connor and the idea of ethical emotivism, like we have a utility when we call something good. My own moral and ethical philosophy is highly compliant to Dr. Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication model. And that model implies that good and evil are encoded into our language to talk about how we interact with the good or harm of something and how we judge it as a result. When we say, oh, that's good, we treat it in language as if something is inherently good. We say that is good. But what we do there is we take a personal subjective appraisal and then try to act as if it is an objective quality. Now, some people's moral and ethical standards are more universalizable than others. And I do think there is such an underlying thing as phenomenological good and evil. But the way that we sort of snap judgment to it in our regular conversations is not assessing that underlying thing. So it's very easy to call Ladybug good or neutral or evil, and a lot harder to talk about, well, what is um, the moral shape of Ladybug as a character, if we're really gonna talk about that brass tacks. So, firstly, talking about intent, Ladybug is a fundamentally peaceful person that wants harm for basically none of the individuals in Bullet Train. And this makes him, well, he has good intentions. He has good intentions with everybody. Um, Even when he finds out that, I don't know. I don't know. Let's talk about it. Because, like, I think to be a minimizer of harm in the kind of job and position that Ladybug is in, um, is enough to lean good. But there is this thing where Ladybug is Ladybug is willing to play people, and Ladybug is willing to um, play people around each other to protect himself. And no example in the moment is so egregious that it makes me doubt his good intentions and morality. Um, and also, you have to consider the incentive structures in place that put him into that position. Um, like, it's a pretty tense situation that he's in, but nevertheless, like, he kicked Tangerine out of the train, uh, and basically, caused him to abandon his own brother. That kind of sucks. But like at the same time, Tangerine was actively talking about slicing him up and putting him in a Momonga costume. So like, that's not very sympathetic. And, it's very easily self-defense at that point. I mean, it was self-defense because it would have been much worse if he had let him stay on the train. Um, but then, you know, selling out the Hornet, to Lemon and Tangerine in order to uh, protect himself, aren't very good intentions. But the Hornet is a murderer that murdered the son, so that's not does that that saves his hide, but it's also justice to some extent. Um, and so none of his self-protective actions are so egregious that they would call his morality into question or make him lean towards neutral in terms of selfishness and self-protectiveness. Um, could he have done something like that? Maybe, but without seeing it in the film, it's like harder to assess um, whether or not his moral principles towards things like pacifism would have made him turn away in that kind of moment. Um, this is the thing. So intentions are the easier part of this. Actions is harder. So Ladybug participates in a dirty business where he does things that are immoral and illegal, which is why he has to be an operative in a sort of covert, secret way, in order to pursue these kinds of ends for people with probably not so noble intentions, probably intentions for power or dominance in XYZ way. Now, of the immoral jobs that Ladybug could be committed to, theft, most likely from people who already are embroiled in larger immoral criminal enterprises, is not that bad. Now, that's not to say necessarily that criminality is associated with evil. I think that um, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul do an interesting job of comparing and contrasting and say. What I would say is that the incentive structures of a criminal environment uh, cause the frequent infractions of common law, and when that's off the table, things become all fair in love and war. There's not a standard of decency that is kept. Um, and I think that even in the environment that Ladybug is in, Ladybug attempts to preserve that with his sort of staunch pacifism. Um, so, given the incentive structure that Ladybug is immersed in due to his job, I think that he does a good job of attempting to be moral. Because we have to weigh his actions versus the counter incentives and then think about, okay, well, where does he lean when all that's considered? So, this is talking explicitly about how morality is a difficult thing to judge because um, not only do we rapid fire assess it in our daily lives as a heuristic, calling something good or bad, um, the 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 amount of incentives that are active on us um, on a regular basis, and the almost inability to do good in a broader sense given those incentive structures. There's the scene from The Good Place where, they do the tally of sin, and even like buying, a thing of flowers from a grocery store for someone as a gift has so many hidden underlying moral costs of exploitation that come from the larger nature of incentive structures and power. Um, and Ladybug interfaces with that system, is embroiled in some of its more negative attributes because of the nature of his job, and yet still strives to be a good person, and not in in my opinion the sense of a sort of self-righteous fantasy as much as legitimately caring about others and doing the hard thing. If we're going to judge Ladybug by his self-preservation, what do we make of him going back into the train when the prince gets her bag stuck? If a character was purely committed to saving their own skin, he wouldn't have done that. And so it's pretty hard for me to look at a character like that who showcases that kind of behavior and say, well, they are neutral for self protection. There are characters that commit to much worse moral acts out of self preservation, and Ladybug is not one of them. In a clear fight between his self preservation and his good values win out. So that goes to show something. But morality always needs to be a more complex conversation because it's far too easy to sort of shoot from the hip and say good or evil instead of trying to assess how a character participates in their larger environment. And Ladybug only has good intentions. He's only pursuing peace with basically everyone. And the only instance where he sort of acts in violence is retaliatory self defense against the Hornet, who literally already lethally poisoned him. Um, and even then, he was like, "You don't have a backup?" You know, because he was after saving himself, but he didn't want her to die. He just wanted her to show him where the poison is or where the antidote is. Um, so again, it's just very indicative. I think that I could squarely call Ladybug a good character, given the sort of dynamics between them. In my opinion, squarely chaotic and squarely good. Now, Maria is interesting. I'll give you a second to read this before I pop back up. So, Maria is harder. Um, I wrote about my reasoning underneath my webcam right now, but in my opinion, Maria is evil. And evil comes down to two things. It comes down to a mixture of intent and actions. Um, do I think that Maria has malicious intent? Absolutely not. I think that Maria acts rationally, and I think that Maria um, could even care about other people if she didn't suppress herself emotionally in a way that made that difficult. You know, third emotion, the standard sort of IXTJ emotional sensitivity. Um, I think the real problem is that Maria participates in mass systemic harm. Um, Maria, as most likely a handler for multiple criminals, participates much more willingly in moral harm. She advises practical action, like taking the gun, which Ladybug hesitates on. So, um, Ladybug is concerned with moral cost. Maria is concerned with getting the job done. And if this was solely a thing that she was applying to herself as an individual, that would be one thing. With her attempting to coordinate violence and harm at scale, she becomes a heavy ethical facilitator in some pretty bad activity. Now, that's harder, I think, for people to say because we don't greet Maria as an evil person. Maria is, uh, gentle, seemingly kind, helpful, for Ladybug for, participating towards his ends. And we don't really get to see Maria do anything that morally harmful. It would be much easier then to sort of vibe type Maria as lawful neutral. But the way that she participates in broad systemic harm, I think, cannot be ignored in terms of its moral consequence. Um, you know, Ladybug only does snatch and grab jobs, but Maria is familiar with this entire network of assassins in such a way that, if she facilitates that action herself, it's hard to imagine that Maria is the handler for only Ladybug. Um, I think that would also, diminish her personally going to rescue Ladybug at the end if that was her only responsibility. Um, but you know, it's tough because I think people would like Maria, and if you like a character, it's harder to put that label on them. But in terms of their moral cost, I think they're evil. Now, um, Lemon is Lemon is, in my opinion, neutral. Um, Lemon cares about goodness and cares about morality, but is very willing to commit immoral actions because of that. And that kind of mixture makes him lean neutral and moral standing. Um, I think that mixture also makes him sympathetic to uh, the argument that Ladybug tries to make for sort of diminishing harm and getting things back to normal. But I don't think Ladybug actually cares that much. So while he's like lightly sympathetic about it, he's also pretty committed to the mission, and what he's determined is the path of things and what is smart to do in them. Like, yeah, goodness would be nice, but what if um, he actively reasons with Ladybug when Ladybug tries to make a moral argument. It's like, what if the person punishes you for not having the case? Lose lose. Um, and outside of morality, Lemon pragmatically argues that he needs a fall guy, and that given Occam's razor, that Ladybug probably killed the son. Um, and so, you know, it's interesting. By the end of the movie, um, you have Yuichi, the Elder, Lemon, and Ladybug. And I think that two of them are pretty much good, Ladybug and the Elder. And I think Lemon and Yuichi, given their criminal past and leanings, are much more neutral, but I think they lean good or have good leaning tendencies that are worth talking about. Um, so it's because by the end of the movie, you really do have like solely the characters committed to good, which is part of the reason that they can learn to coordinate even past their personal tragedies, which they have in part inflicted on each other. So, Tangerine, meanwhile, is again, do I think that Tangerine has malicious intent? No, but he much more willingly participates in mass harm. The amount of killings that Tangerine has done without real consideration for morality under the guise of professionalism is a lot. And uh, that participation in broad systemic evil without the counterbalance of intent strikes to me as evil. Um, and he doesn't care. He doesn't care about Ladybug's moral alignment. He doesn't acknowledge the goodness in Ladybug's actions. For one, um, Tangerine's exposure to Ladybug is not in broad moral action, but um, in the way in which he is a nuisance to the broader mission. And that is where Tangerine confronts Ladybug as, because Tangerine is a shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy, and he doesn't sit and ask, who is Ladybug? He relies, I think, on Lemon to do that, given his own inferior NI. Um, and so, he doesn't really care about Ladybug's moral alignment, and even if he knew it, he would discard that for the sake of the mission. So, the prince. Um, Again, I've said this in almost every dynamic analysis I've recorded so far between these two. The prince doesn't understand Ladybug, and basically just uses the same routine she uses on everybody with Ladybug. Um, if she did understand, she would know that his good intentions would make him a bad gunman against the White Death. The Elder is good as well, reads Ladybug in terms of NI and FE, and concludes that he is good, and so they have a very amiable interaction between each other. And then the White Death does not care about Ladybug and does not care about goodness in general, probably viewing it as weakness given his larger core 8 3 fix mentality, and doesn't acknowledge it in the Elder, so why would he acknowledge it in Ladybug? And these are the chaotic good characters that are gold tier. Now, you'll notice that this list leans very highly ESXP. That's normal. So there's a broad dynamic in the four-letter system where EXXP kind of is a stand-in for chaotic and IXXJ is a stand-in for order. That's not always the case. I think that there can be characters that are EXXP and lawful, and IXXP and chaotic, or IXXJ and chaotic. I was thinking about, I would almost call, if Tangerine were not so adaptable, I would almost call Tangerine chaotic. No, I would almost call, no, sorry, I would almost call Tangerine lawful, because Tangerine is so committed to doing things the right way that he's, highly debated even as an ENTJ. Like when, Lemon refers to him as a Gordon, which is, I think a gold tier ESTJ in the personality database. And so, hardline, rigid, wants to get things done. And so there's almost something, there's an argument you can make there, but it's also a conflicting thing because his adaptability conflicts that. So I think neutral in terms of law and chaos is good orientation for him. But most of the time for people to vote on something in consensus as a gold tier, it has to be definitive. It has to be definitive and has to be obvious on a superficial and on a deeper level. And these characters, being ESXP adjacent, are not, there's not a real debate between chaotic and neutral. Like they pretty decisively lean to the chaotic and unstructured end of the spectrum. And so they fit into place. So Glimmer is an interesting comparison because, she is majority ISFP, same as Ladybug, with some debate for ESFP. Maybe the ESFP vote is right. I noticed the same, kind of vote distribution with Shaggy. And so there are similar characters to Ladybug who are debated for their ISFP status. And so, do I want to directly compare Glimmer and Ladybug? Probably not, because I don't really know Glimmer that well. I think that she's highly voted SEE, and I think that Ladybug has a much more difficult and ignoring sort of id block relationship with Force. So I don't think I'd want to put that on him or sort of cross compare the two in that way. But chaotic, like I said before, morality is a very broad category, and so it's not a thing where this character squarely fits this more decisive thing. Chaotic good is like a jelly. It morphs to what the character is in a more, so that this is a whole grab bag. But also note their chaotic leanings, pretty clearly and obviously, and that helps to contextualize why they are so definitively voted on that. Because good is easier to sort of, put on as a sticker, but chaotic is harder unless a character is broadly chaotic. So that kind of explains their distributions. And that is it. That is everything. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.